In this tutorial, what I'm going to look at is the nonlinear deformers. So nonlinear deformers can be found here under Deform menu, nonlinear, and we have these options here. And these can be found within the modeling menu. So I'm not going to look at these completely in detail. I'm just going to look at the idea of what they are, but just an initial bit of setup. So I'm just going to create a quick Polycube. Let's give this some height and some sections, and I'm just going to give this some more segments. Okay, just to allow it to deform more easily. I'm going to take a copy of this. So this is my original Polycube. I'm just going to make some copies of this for each of the different versions. So there are, on that thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different versions. So let's grab this. I'm going to Control D to duplicate. Just move this out of the way, and then I'm going to do a Shift D to duplicate with the space that I set between these first two. So Control D to duplicate the first lot, and then Shift D to duplicate with the transform. Just another thing, I'm just going to make another copy of this, but what I want to do, if I just as a little side note, if I Control D and duplicate this, I can't actually get into the input of this, so I can't get rid of these sections without going in and deleting them. So what we can do is I can go to Edit and do a Duplicate Special. I'm just going to go into the options for this. And under this, let's just reset this. I'm going to have one copy. I'm going to make sure that I'm doing a copy rather than instance. I'm just going to have this grouped under the world. And down here, this is the important thing. I'm going to duplicate the input graph and apply this. Let's drag this to one side. What this is going to allow me to do is have the original input on this. It's just in the way of duplicating. So generally, if we duplicate something, Control D, we're getting rid of the input on there. So doing the duplicate special and just highlighting that. Duplicate the input, we have access to the original shape. So all I'm going to do in this, I'm just going to set these properties down. Let's go set this down. Okay. Just as an illustration for something. So in terms of applying these deformers, all you need to do is click on a mesh, go up to Deform, Nonlinear, and let's just choose, for example, the bend. So what this does is it creates a handle within the object. So we may need to go in and just click this on X-ray, so we can actually see this. I've got my wireframe unshaded as well as my X-ray, and you can see we've got this handle under here. We can also access this through the outliner. So we have this bend handle here. Okay, so if we need it, we can grab it there. So we have two ways of accessing the properties. I can go into the bend tool within the channel box, and we have our values here. So say go into the curvature, just using my middle mouse button just to change this value. We have that there. I can also go into my attribute editor, and just under the bend we have the curvature here as well. Okay. So just as the first note about this, when using these nonlinear deformers, we need enough geometry to allow this deform smoothly. So if I was to do this on this one, this is the reason I made this shape. Let's deform, nonlinear, let's just put a bend on this. What bend did I have on this? So we had a curvature for this, so this is 65. Let's grab this. If I can't select that, let's just get the bend handle there. Let's set this to 65 as well. So you can see it's not going to work as smoothly because we don't have as much geometry. So that's just something to consider when you're using these deformers. Let's get rid of that. Oh, it's just as an illustration. So back to this. The first thing to note is that the handle always comes in pointing towards the Y axis. You can actually rotate this. You can click on rotate. We can move this around and change the position of this. Okay, so we can change that around. And we can also change the we can scale this as well, by the way, but I wouldn't really do that. It just gives a bit of weirdness on that. These two things are interlinked as well, so if I was to move either away from itself, so if I move this away from the handle, you can see that we're creating problems with that. Similarly, if I move the handle away, we're going to create issues there as well. So actually best keeping these in the original positions. When you're happy with what you've done, what you can do is you can delete the history. So if you delete the history, it's going to break the connection between this and the handle, and then you'll be able to move that independently. So another way to actually set the properties of this, we can go in and we can use our manipulator. So go to Modify, Transformation Tools, and Show Manipulator Tool. That brings us over here. We can also press the shortcut T to bring this up. So click on the Move tool, click on this, click on T, shortcut. We have the ability to use the manipulators here. And these will change depending on the actual deformer. So here I have my curvature, and I've got my low and high bounds of this as well. If I go into this, you'll actually see these changing. So my high bound, actually what I'm doing there is I'm changing the starting point of this curvature by moving this about. Okay, move this back and the curve the whole way around. If I want to do this from the top, I can bring this in and that'll just curve it there. Okay, so we can change that value on there. Set this to 1, that is up to the whole thing, and let's set this to -1, and that will just reset that back to where it was. So let's try another one. Let's go into here and deform, nonlinear, and this time we'll do a flare. So this is a couple more options on here, and again, if we can go in here, we have the low bound and high bound still. We've got a start flare X and Z and an end flare X and Z, and then we have a curve on this as well. So if I click on these and move these out, this is our start flare X, start flare Z. So we can flare this out, can also flare this in or out at the top here. And then this is our curvature. So we can curve this out, curve this in. Again, we can limit this with our high bounds and low bounds. So bring this out. We're going to change the starting position of this flare. Again, if I set this to -1, we can get our next one. We can bring this in, which is our high bound. And again, I can reset that by setting that to 1. Okay. So the flare is just creating this flared, tapered look. So let's look at our next one. So this is using a sine wave. Again, if I just go into the options for this. So let's go into the amplitude here. Let's start bringing the amplitude up, which is going to create our sine wave. Okay. If I bring the wavelength in, we're creating more iterations of this, so we're actually increasing the amplitude of the the wavelength of the sine wave. We have an offset, so actually I can move this sine wave up and down as well, which is changing the object. And we have a drop off from the mesh, how far the bounds of the mesh go towards the sine wave as well. Let's just set this back to 0, which is going to follow the sine wave exactly as is. And you can see here with the geometry that to get this perfect, we would need more segments throughout this. So our next one, we have a squash. Get to the options for this. So here we have basically it's like a squash and stretch. So if I bring this out, we're squashing it in, If we bring that out or push that in, then we're stretching that out. Okay. We have a max position, so we can actually change where the maximum amount of squash or stretch is happening within the object. So we can just bring that up and down. That is our squash factor. Our start smoothness and our end smoothness. We can change how this is working around the bounds of the squash and stretch as well. Bring this in. And again, we have our lower bound. And we have our high bound, as always. So that's our squash and stretch. And next we have our twist. So here we have our end angle, and here we have our start angle. Okay, so you can bring that in. And again, we have our low and high bound values as well, if we want to control this. So if I bring my high bound up, so quite useful for if you're creating some ornate banister. Okay. And then the final one is the wave. So let's go in, let's deform the wave value. If I just bring up the wavelength on this, and I need to just rotate this round. Let's get this right. Where are you? Let's just get this. It's actually a bit easier with this one to show it on a plane. Let me just bring out a plane object. Let's go into our inputs. Let's just take the size of this up. Put more segments on this. And let's put this on here. I need to up the amplitude as well. Actually, that's what I was doing on this one. I hadn't upped the amplitude, so let's just up that amplitude now. So you'll see now when I rotate this round, there we go. We're actually changing that. It is actually easy to see this on a plane. You can see we have our wavelength, we have our amplitude on this, our strength of our wavelength. And then we have our offset for this as well. So you can create really nice effects using this. Let's just bring my wavelength down. Bring my amplitude down a little bit. So you can create this kind of a ripple effect. Something like that. And now with the offset, I could have that moving around and rippling like so. Let's just do the same on this. So let's go in. So let's bring my amplitude down. Bring our wavelength down. So have something like that. And again, we could play around with the offset on this to create that kind of effect. Okay. So that's all of our non-linear deformers. So we have our bend, we have our flare, we've got our sine wave or a sine, we have our squash, a twist, and our wave there. And the great thing about these, as well as being able to use them in a modeling sense, we can also animate any of these as well. So I was looking at this example here. I was just looking at creating this, changing the offset on this. So I could go in on this and actually, let's key selected. Just my modeling standard. Let's just go to my classic. Just have my timeline. Let's just move forward in the timeline and let's just change the offset. And again, right click, key selected. And there we have that animated. And we can do that with any of these properties within here as well. So two uses for the nonlinear deformers. So we can use them as a modeling tool, or we can use them as an animation tool. Okay, so that's just a quick introduction to the nonlinear deformers.